I am delighted to be with you all tonight. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you to Amada for your work in organizing this, and thank you also to everybody on our alumni relations team, and especially to Shan for leading this important conversation. As I'm greeting you from the President's House, it's on, for those of you who are thinking about Sarah Lawrence right now and want the sense of what campus is like, the wisteria is in full bloom, which means that commencement is a week and a bit away. And people are frantically in the midst of all of those conference projects and everything else on campus. So thank you for joining us from around the world. As you know, this year the college has sought to foster conversation and events around the theme of justice and the inequities, racial, political, environmental, economic, to name just a few, that are prevalent in our society and around the globe. The news today is filled with troubling headlines in a year that seems to constantly compound upon itself. The murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others, and the images of a mob storming our nation's capital on January the 6th are seared in our minds. And these events, too many to count, took place against the backdrop of a devastating pandemic that has fanned the flames of hate and sparked an increase in harassment and violence toward Asian and Pacific Islander communities in the U.S. In Georgia, as you know, only a few weeks ago, 6 Asian women were killed in a mass shooting. And hate crimes against the Asian and Pacific Islander communities have increased by 150%, according to a recent study by the California State University at San Bernardino Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism. We all know that hate has no place at Sarah Lawrence or anywhere else. And so this evening, I'm very glad to welcome Shan Wu, MFA of the class of '84, for a presentation about what it means to prosecute these injustices as hate crimes. In addition to being an SLC alumnus, Shan is also a member of our board of trustees. He is a practicing attorney and legal analyst. Some of you recognize him from CNN, where he regularly appears. He's a former federal prosecutor, and he was former counsel to Attorney General Janet Reno. And so I'm delighted to welcome Shan here virtually and would like to hand over to him tonight. Thank you, Shan, for being with us.
Thank you, Crystal. Very much appreciate it. And let me start by saying a word of appreciation to you, Crystal, for your extraordinary leadership during really a historically challenging time for all of us during this global pandemic. I think Sarah Lawrence has been very fortunate to have you leading us at this time. So starting off tonight, I'd actually like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you from Alexandria, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the Piscataway. This area was Piscataway land, and I want to offer them some honor and respect for this land that I'm sitting on. So as Crystal has mentioned, there's been this really horrific uptick in anti-Asian harassment, violence, even murders. And what we're going to talk about a little bit tonight is looking at that issue in 3 parts. We're going to look at the problem itself and a bit of the history, because it's not really a new problem, as well as some potential solutions for it. And if we look first, let's turn first to what the problem is. And looking just at New York City, the New York City Police Department has indicated that there's been a 1,900% increase in hate crime incidents driven by anti-Asian sentiment. And I had written a piece on CNN about the necessity to combat this with using hate crimes, and that was written before the Atlanta murders. And of course, we've had those terrible murders in Atlanta of the 6 Asian women at Asian-owned businesses. In addition to that, the Stop AAPI group has been cataloging these types of incidents. And since the beginning of COVID, they've cataloged some 3,000 hate crime incidents. And many of these, as we're seeing on these very troubling still photos, and many of these videos have been on the internet, involved elderly Asians as well, simply being assaulted for no reason by people on the street. And that's been of particular concern, since elderly folks, can be much more defenseless. And what's the reason for this? Well, it's hard to quantify the nexus between this rise in anti-Asian violence and President Trump's rhetoric, calling COVID-19 not COVID-19, but his insistence on referring to it as the China flu, making fun of a stereotype of Asians as being martial arts expert, calling it the Kung flu. And sadly, not even President Trump, but also other legislators, state, federal, other politicians have followed suit with that. So one can't necessarily prove that nexus, that that type of rhetoric causes the violence, but what we can quantify is the amount of violence that's happened and putting a face to the people who have been victims of that crime. And if we go back for a moment to that previous slide, there was this one, besides the Atlanta spa shootings, right before that, there was the murder of an 84-year-old Thai immigrant, Vicha Ratanapki. And as you can see in this still, elderly gentleman, 84 years old, and was basically slammed to the ground, and he died from those injuries. And that's just one horrible example, but as the next slide shows, it's just a graphic of just how many incidents have been reported, and they span the spectrum of people being bothered on the street, telling them that they brought COVID here, telling them to go back to their country, all the way to the horrible extreme situation of assaults and actual murders. Something that's important for us to realize as we look at this is that this is not a new problem for Asians in this country. And it's not a new problem for people of color in the country. There has been a history of racial-based, gender-based violence in the country. And I want to focus briefly on just some of the major examples of that history. And so in this timeline, we'll see that as early as 1871, there was a lynching of 18 Chinese men in the heart of what is today downtown Los Angeles. A mob of some 500 people strung them up and murdered them. 1885, there was what's known as the Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming, where 28 Chinese miners were murdered. In between that was a piece of legislation, rather infamous now, which was the Chinese Exclusion Act. That legislation remains to this day the only federal legislation that was directed at excluding a particular race, a particular country of people from coming to the United States. Fast forward a little bit to another piece of legislation during World War II, the incarceration of Japanese Americans in what they called camps, but really were concentration camps. And that's the also infamous Executive Order 9066, an example of legislated racial targeting of Asians. And lest we think that that is all hopefully more in the distant past, in the 1980s, during a period of economic tension in Detroit, where the US auto industry was under a lot of pressure and competition from Japan, there was a young Chinese man, Vincent Chin, who was going out to celebrate his impending wedding, his bachelor's party. And that night, he encountered two white auto workers who beat him to death with a baseball bat, mistaking him for a Japanese and saying to him, one of them said to him, "It's because of you, you little MF, that we're out of work." And these are just some of the more notable examples, and they're selected for a reason. I mean, Vincent Chin's last words that were spoken were quite haunting, saying, "It isn't fair, it isn't fair." If we take a look at some of these situations and we ask ourselves, well, these are really horrible, what did the criminal justice system do to remedy this? And the answer is not very much, unfortunately. If you take a look at that lynching in 1871, all charges were overturned. Nobody was convicted. Nobody paid a price for that. In the Rock Spring Massacre, there were no criminal charges ever filed. And in the Vincent Chin case, they were sentenced at the state level to really just a slap on the wrist. They were given probation, a fine. Later, the Justice Department did try to bring federal hate crimes charges, which ultimately got reversed on appeal. So essentially, there was no justice in any of those cases. And we might wonder why that is. Well, we might get a hint of that from a rather iconic American jurist, Judge Roy Bean. And some of you may remember there was a kind of a biopic about him starring Paul Newman. And in a real case, Judge Roy Bean once ruled about the murder of a Chinese person. He said, "I've read the entire 1879 revised statutes of Texas, and there ain't a damn line nowhere that makes it illegal to kill a Chinaman." And so that gives us some sense of the institutionalization, just how ingrained in the system this type of devaluing of Asian lives have been. And in this slide here, if you look in the upper left corner, that's a cartoon from the 19th century, and in the bottom right is another one. And you see the obvious physical violence being directed at the portrayal of the Chinese in those days with the pigtail hairstyle being pulled. In the other one, obviously, the Chinese is being actually lynched. In the middle there, there's Vincent Chin's mother speaking at a time for the memorial, and there are flowers for the Atlanta murders. And down the middle there is pictures of the Japanese families who had been uprooted. So these are all a spectrum of the type of devaluing of Asian life. And we are going to look at some of the possible reasons for that devaluing, some of the ways that Asians have been looked at. And one of the notions that some of you may be familiar with is this idea of othering, how we treat different people as someone apart from us. This is something that happens to others, not to us. And the definition of othering, as this slide indicates, is often referring to a process by which individuals or groups of people attribute negative characteristics to other groups of people based on something that sets them apart, that makes them different. And in a sense, that's a very natural human reaction. People tend to otherize when they see something different. But it has very important real-world consequences and manifestations. Let's take a look at some of them. When you treat a group of people or another person as someone not like you, they don't then deserve the same protections as you would. And the way that's been manifested oftentimes in violence is the way people are treated. You see in the upper corner there, the image of the fire hose being used on African Americans. There's the South Africa shot there of the police with the baton raised. And at the bottom, you'll see a caricature of a Chinese person looking with the traditional Chinese dress, the sort of pigtail, the teeth, being made fun of because they're trying to adopt American customs. And on the bottom, you'll see 19th century type portrayals of the association of Asians at that time, very crowded together in an opium den, contrasted with the very wholesome image of the white European ancestry worker coming home to their family. And so these are examples of image and manifestation of violence that can come from this idea of the othering of people. And for Asians in particular, one of the othering roots has to do with this concept called the Yellow Peril. And the Yellow Peril has taken various forms in TVs and movies and political literature, is this idea that the Asian race is of a great danger. They're teeming, there are lots of them. This particular cartoon shows the idea of them having tentacles into dangerous things, possibly taking over the world. And that's a notion that applies, of course, not just to Asians, but it's the idea that brown, yellow people, non-white people, more of them may endanger the white minority. And the danger of looking at people that way, the danger of hearing that, is the word horde is really dehumanizing. Hordes of insects, hordes of vermin. It isn't the type of association you should have with humans. Because what else is a horde? Inhuman creatures, like, for example, the next slide, zombies. This is a slide from World War Z, the zombie movie. And interestingly enough, they are attacking a wall there. And we can all recall how important it was for President Trump to build a wall to keep out the types of people we don't want in the United States. And that kind of dehumanization notion is what can really lead to a condoning of violence that can happen. And in order to combat that, we have to think a little bit more, I believe, about how we think of other people as being different. What is this othering? And I'll use sort of a seemingly innocuous example of food. Other cultures, other countries, other religions may eat different food than white Americans do. And if you recall the beginning days of COVID, in Wuhan, there was a lot of speculation, continues to be, that it may have originated in some of the markets there, and that these were what they call wet markets, where they sell wild game. And there are many people who express great horror at this idea that there were these markets, very unsanitary, this idea of eating bats, for example. And this idea came from the notion of it's a very different kind of culture. Rooted behind this very different kind of culture idea is also this doctrine called the Doctrine of Discovery. And that is originally from a church doctrine, which basically licensed the European explorers to go out and conquer, to try and convert people, to discover lands. And this is intertwined because, as the Native American thinker Mark Charles says about the Doctrine of Discovery, he has said that you cannot discover lands that are already occupied. So this particular slide, we see the depiction of Columbus discovering America. And this really goes to the heart of the objection of this type of image. Because there was already a culture here, there are already lands here. So this idea of the discovery is, oh, we've discovered something kind of alien and we want to erase the presence of what was there. Great example of that in very modern times. Just a couple weeks ago, former Senator Rick Santorum, a former colleague of mine on CNN, was speaking to a group of young conservatives, and he was talking about the birth of our country, America. And he literally said that when we came here, there was nothing. And he said, oh, sure, there were Native Americans, but they haven't contributed very much, to this culture. And so when you look at how prevalent that notion is, even continuing from this long ago Doctrine of Discovery right up through colonialism, right up to the present day, it makes one think about, again, how do we end up coming to this position? And going back to my point about the food, there are, of course, other countries, other cultures which eat food that's different than ours. In some situations, beef may not be a proper food to eat, or pork, for example. But when you look at this debate, this reaction that happened to these idea of these wet markets in Wuhan and Chinese people eating weird things, so to speak, you have even heard of the sort of typical stereotype, oh, Chinese people may eat rats, cats, that sort of thing. I even heard Jay Leno as a kid when I was growing up made a joke about that there were no cats in the area of a Chinese restaurant. Very horrible kind of image. But the horror, of course, arises from this idea of what is normal to eat. Again, using just food as a potentially innocuous example. That's a notion to be challenged. So imagine for a moment if we had a visitor from a different time or different civilization looking at the food that we eat. What would they make of some of the processes, some of the conditions in which we get our own food from? For example, the so-called Franken Chicken. These are some shots of very well-known exposés of the conditions in which these poor chickens are raised. And you see one of the Franken chickens, which is genetically designed to be, so obese that it's slaughtered for food before it ever even can stand, and it has, great deformities. And that raises the question of what really is different And something like food can be so easily seen as, oh, that's so different. Everyone should understand people eat different foods, and yet there's this otherization, there's this stigmatization of what other cultures may eat. And it's very interesting because when you think about this particular metaphor about the food, we can go to the next slide. It conflates with this notion of the others as another race, as another country. In these 19th century cartoons, there's this notion of being afraid that America may be devoured by the cheap labor of China. And it's quite grotesque, as you see there. Uncle Sam's literally being eaten. And it's a very primal kind of image there. And that's because there's a very primal fear. There is a deep primal fear that is awakened by this type of racist rhetoric about the danger of these other people. And that leads to condoning, to allowing, to encouraging violence to be taken out against them. So what kind of solutions can we have for this? And the question we posed at the beginning is, are hate crime prosecutions a possible solution for this? And so my answer is yes and no, very literally answer to that. And let's first explain that by learning a little bit about, what are hate crimes. And hate crimes legislation are typically sentencing enhancements. And what that means is if a defendant is convicted of a crime and that crime is found to have been motivated by racial or other types of bias, then the punishment that they receive is going to be greater because of that. And an example of that, I think in the next slide, would be the specific statute in Georgia. And there you can see that if the object of the offense was done because of the victim or group of victims' actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, sex, sexual orientation, gender, mental disability, or physical disability, then the judge imposes a greater sentence. And that perceived is very important. Remember the Vincent Chin case where they mistakenly thought he was a different ethnic group than he was. And so sometimes there's a debate about hate crimes and whether we need hate crime statutes. And we're going to discuss a little bit about why they aren't used more. But if we pose the question, why do we even have hate crimes laws? Well, here, there are 2 points I'd like to make. The first is by the ADL. And the ADL has been a great pioneer in America in drafting hate crimes legislation and putting it forth for state as well as federal use. And their point here is that the existence of a hate crime statute is very valuable because it sends a message to communities that have been victimized. And it tells them that the system actually is there for them as well, that they're not outside of that system. And that's particularly important for immigrant communities. Oftentimes, the immigrants are coming from countries where there was an authoritarian regime and they could not trust the police or associate them with the military. And being here in the United States, they may be very hesitant about reporting crimes because of the concern with interacting with the police themselves. And similarly, in other communities here who domestically have had a bad historical experience with the police, again, there's reluctance to report crimes. And all the legislation in the world is not going to make a bit of difference if you don't get reports. So part of the issue here is it's important to have these to send that message to the community, but also more work needs to be done to let the communities know about the existence of these statutes to help on the reporting end of it. There's another reason too, which these are very valuable, and this is my view as a former prosecutor. And that view is that a person who selects people for violence, criminal acts on the basis of their race, I think they're more dangerous than other kinds of criminals. Someone who gets into a bar fight, has a disagreement, attacks somebody, even kills them, that's terrible crime, they deserve to be punished. But I would argue that they are less dangerous. That's more of a one-off situation. They're less dangerous than someone who is selecting strangers, no context for this other than the fact that they're selecting them on the basis of some characteristic. So those are two strong reasons why the hate crimes legislation can be and is a very valuable tool. But as I have pointed out in my article, there is a problem. And the problem is it's really not being utilized enough. Why is it not being utilized enough? Well, one important caveat I have to point out is that it is very, very difficult to get good statistics on hate crimes. You'll notice in the early slides when we talked about the incidents being reported, those are incidents. It's very hard to drill down and find how many of those turned into charges, much less convictions. So that's another issue, which is the type of fact gathering makes that analysis very difficult. But from my own experience and also watching what's going on in the news right now, I think there's another problem here that stops the statutes from being properly utilized. And that's what I term to be prosecutor reluctancy. And we will get to that in a moment. But let's look at the idea of how we can broaden the hate crimes reach. The COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which is up on the screen right now, that's a good start. Certainly better than the president using racist rhetoric. And that is something which is calling for more resources, better reporting, even tasking someone at the Justice Department specifically on these types of hate crimes. That's a good start. But to get past that, to really get some results, and to deal with the idea of the prosecutor's reluctance for that, let's take a look at Atlanta as an example. And we had seen the Georgia hate crimes statute. So in the Atlanta murders, you have both police and prosecutors somewhat reluctant or downplaying what would seem to most people to be a pretty obvious racial motivation. The shooter in Atlanta killed 6 Asian women. They were all at Asian businesses. He did not go to other kinds of businesses. He selected those businesses. So it would seem, at least to me, it's a no-brainer that race played a factor in this. Now, certainly gender played a factor in this as well, and those would both be bases for hate crimes. Why then is there this reluctance, this hesitation? We talk about vaccine hesitancy. This is prosecutor hesitancy. Why aren't they being charged that way? Well, part of the answer may be something I experienced as a young prosecutor myself, which was I had a case, a pretty low-level case, simple assault at a train station, where during the crime, the defendant yelled out a racist term. So I brought it to my supervisor, who was a very experienced supervisor and mentored generations of prosecutors. And he tried to dissuade me from bringing that charge. He said, that's an added burden of proof for the government. It might hurt the rest of the case. There might be First Amendment issues. And I was dissuaded by that. I did not charge it. And later, I regret that. There are a couple of myths there I'll just briefly bust. It's not harder to prove a hate crimes case because you still have to prove the underlying charge. So if it's murder or assault, you still got to prove that. And it's not like the person is going to be acquitted of what they did because the jury doesn't buy that the reason for it was race. So that's one myth to get rid of right there. The other is the First Amendment argument, which you may hear sometimes. That's just nonsense. The Supreme Court has made it very clear that hate crimes legislation is not punishing speech. It's punishing the conduct, the criminal conduct that occurs there. And so my own reaction as a young prosecutor, many years later, I look back on that and think to myself, why did I go along with that? I should have known better. Well, it goes to a complex issue of a dynamic that I'm going to show you a diagram about, which is the kind of external effect of historical racism. And some of that can be very explicit racism, lynchings, legislation. And then there's the internalization of that aspect, which is what happens to everybody growing up with that history, with that atmosphere, which then lends itself to an institutionalization of those concepts. So even for people of color like myself, minority Asian American, I had internalized some of these ideas. And when I entered the institution of a prosecutor's office, I carried that with me as well. And that implicit racism, that implicit internalization from these external factors is part of perhaps the biggest part of the problems with our structures, which is why we can't get equal justice, because the inequality has come from a place that is so ingrained in our psyches, and therefore our psyches bring that to the institutions themselves. This diagram is from Mark Charles and Soong Chang Ra's book, Unsettling Truths. And it shows you that it's really just a dynamic. It's a continuous loop that goes on with this issue. And so if we really want to think about how we can solve this type of problem, certainly more hate crimes prosecutions are important. And it may take some time because there aren't that many of them brought. Prosecutors need to change their own ideas, and they need to start charging anti-Asian violence as hate crimes. Because when you charge them, you're not only prosecuting the violence or the crimes, but you're really trying to attack the hateful intent behind the crimes. And that will take time. They may not be easy cases to prove. People may have the idea of, oh, well, this was a terrible person, he was a murderer, but we don't really know that it was motivated on account of race. But they have to take that action. When I was a young prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office, we had a saying there, which was that some cases need to be tried. And many of these hate crimes cases fall exactly into that category. They have to be tried. They have to be brought forward. Because if you don't do that, if you don't use a law that's on the books, you essentially erase that law. And so often what's happening with that erasure is people are forgetting the history. They are falling prey to this implicit and institutionalized beliefs. This slide in particular, I found very troubling, some of the comments here, which is the Justice Department has something called the China Initiative. And that's something that they throw everything into, which has to do with Chinese theft of trade secrets, FARA violations. It's all part of the China Initiative. We don't have something called the Russian Initiative. Separate cases have separate names and they're separate investigations. And this is an unthinking categorization of things because they're Chinese. And that doesn't help. The FBI director has talked about the economic competition with China. There are economic espionage, regular counter-espionage work going on. And that's normal, and that's properly part of the Justice Department's authority. But look what he said about it. He said that the Chinese have basically stolen their way up the economic ladder, and that's why it's so important to make sure that we are bringing these kinds of cases. That falls right into this type of assumption that the Chinese are kind of sneaky, that these economic gains they have weren't proper, that they were stolen in that sense. So these are the kinds of assumptions that kind of sneak their way into our institutions, and they come from a place of implicit racism, external factors that cause people to internalize them, and then they bring that into our institutions, into our justice system, into our businesses, into our courts. And so the question posed in the beginning, which is, are hate crime prosecutions the answer to anti-Asian violence? It's yes and no, because yes, they should be prosecuted. No, because it can't be the entire answer. But using those laws is something that really has to be done, because failing to use them is what takes the laws off the books. And when you take those laws off the books for a particular group of people, you basically erase the history of those people. You don't pay attention to what has happened to them. And for all of these victims, from the 1800s to Vincent Chin to the scores of people who have been harassed in the streets, assaulted, their lives cannot be erased. And so we can start to do something about that by at least using the laws that we have on the books. At least that's a start. So I'll leave it here and happy to take any questions about that.
Thank you, Shan. Um, I'm happy to read out any questions that you choose to put in the chat. So please do start typing. In the meantime, I wanted to ask about film. I'm thinking about film noir because I love film noir. And there's the 70s movie Chinatown starring Jack Nicholson and Faye Dunaway. And the iconic line from that is, Jake, it's Chinatown, which is something that gets repeated in a lot of other similar films. It's set in Los Angeles. And the idea is that you can have an understanding of the world, you can have a familiarity with people or what's going to happen, what people's motivation is, but in Chinatown, all bets are off, right? And so there's that whole trope of inscrutability that goes hand in hand with some of the other tropes that you were mentioning. And I was wondering where, I mean, obviously that is based in difference and fear about race and all of these things, but how do we see around that, like in our culture? How do we not see others as hard to understand? Like, how do we make a connection that humanizes people?
I think that is a great example that permeates probably hundreds of movies, the idea of the mysterious Orient and how those are otherized people. And, you know, that's a very complex question, but it's the most important one for us as a country to wrestle with right now, this question. And I think we start by recognizing what the differences are and to learn about those differences, because as always, it's ignorance that breeds the fear.
Right.
And it's the sloppy way of thinking, the lazy way of thinking, just let's not pay attention, let's not learn about that. It's just different. Oh, they're so weird, they're so different. That's a child's view of the world. Someone looks different, so you make fun of them. So I think the answer to that is to learn and to challenge why we don't want to learn. And I think that would be a good first step.
Thank you. Okay, so we have some buzzing in the chat. Emily Aviles is curious to hear your thoughts on finding ways to protect Asian American communities without increasing policing. Sorry.
So I think going back to what we were talking about, at a fundamental level, to protect Asians and other particular groups from being targeted, you have to address the ignorance and the fear. And you need to bring those communities more into the consciousness of the mainstream, where mainstream people, for example, using Asians, there's this notion they're the model minority, everything is working fine for them. Well, it's not. I mean, there's enormous poverty, there's enormous challenges that happen with Asians. There's obviously violence going on in the streets, which does not distinguish between your socioeconomic class. So awareness is key to that. And by making people more aware of what's happening in the communities and the history gets so little play of violence, that will help to protect them, to raise the awareness without just having a bigger police presence. But I'm a former prosecutor. I believe you have to have policing and prosecutions, but at a more fundamental level, it's getting rid of the ignorance that's going to protect people.
Thank you. How about Allison's question? Thanks, Shan, for a great presentation. Can you tell us a little bit about your position on how the news media can change their language when talking about China affairs? I hear so often, even from liberal media, talking about China as some type of demon. How can all news media change their language and get rid of their internalized racist language?
There's a great tension there between our news media wanting to be entertaining and entertainment likes a villain. And that's part of the problem, I think, with our mainstream media today, is this idea that journalism is a little bit like professional wrestling, that you have to have people fighting each other over these issues. And I think that's a very deep issue with journalism right now. But certainly things like the FBI director's statement, journalists need to call that out. They need to question that rather than just falling into the default position of, oh yeah, China's an economic competitor. They're up to a lot of things. We have the China initiative. They should stop and question, well, wait a minute, why are you calling it the China initiative? I mean, just do it case by case. Challenge the FBI director. Why are you talking this way about them stealing their way up the economic ladder? So that's a good place for journalists to be challenging those types of implicitly racist terms. And in order to do that, of course, they need to be aware of that themselves. And I think certainly having greater diversity in journalism would be a great help with that as well.
Thank you. A question from Yuan Oliver Jin. Curious about early legal precedents in US history. Okay, so this is a quiz. Territory of New Mexico versus Shan Loom versus Territory of New Mexico versus Shan, Loon versus Rice in Mississippi, etc. What do legal scholars make of these earlier cases involving Chinese migrants? What are the ramifications of these cases? Are you familiar with these cases?
Those particular case names, I'm not familiar with it, but the precedents that happened then, this is a very great question. Thank you. Something that has been erased is how much people of color sought to use the legal system to make changes.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at the African-American history, Rosa Parks, on the bus, that sort of thing. I mean, Rosa was very well trained. It wasn't just one day she decided, to make that position on the bus. There are lots of legal efforts that have been made. And in fact, that included Chinese too. I mean, Chinese people tried to use the courts. A big problem in the 19th century, as we see with the Chinese Exclusion Act, and going back to the original document, is that the idea of who was properly a citizen, who was human, really, to mince no words about it, did not include Asians, did not include African Americans. So the ramifications of that type of precedent, I think, and again, I don't know those particular cases, the ramifications are this problem of dehumanization, seeing others as not the same as the white norm. And I think that's what those ramifications are.
So not a question, but a comment from a fellow former prosecutor, Gabriel Ang. Hate crime prosecutions are important for their deterrent effect. As a former prosecutor also and a Chinese American, racists in particular and society in general need to know that these crimes will be prosecuted and those responsible stand trial. Is that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I agree with that sentiment. And I think, unfortunately, I don't think there are enough cases brought under the hate crimes statutes. And that goes to what I call the prosecutorial reluctance, which is there are all these artificial barriers that have been put in. And speaking of mainstream media, when the Atlanta killings first emerged, you heard a lot of commentators talking, anchors asking, for hate crimes prosecutions, what is the burden? Isn't that a very high burden to make? And it's not. It's a burden just like any other burden you have in criminal prosecutions.
So here's another possibility, restorative justice, right? This is from Mika Dashman. Thank you so much for your presentation, Shan. One of the reasons you cited for the need for increased enforcement of hate crimes legislation is addressing the broader harm to communities that these acts of violence inflict. I would submit that restorative justice can more effectively address the needs of impacted communities while potentially changing the behavior of those responsible for perpetuating hate. Would love to hear your thoughts about restorative justice as applied in this context.
I think restorative justice is actually still a very young principle as it's being implemented in the American legal system. And I think it's very richly deserving of a lot more exploration. Right now, I think the stage it's in, it has limited value. I have some experience with sexual assault prosecutions and in the Title IX arena, and we've seen some of the difficulties that are encountered with the concept of the restorative justice there. The most basic obstacle to that is with restorative justice, right now, the form that it takes, whoever's being accused has to be able to step into that role. And in the criminal justice system, it would require them to take responsibility to basically make an admission of guilt And then the justice part of that is really talking more about the consequences, what the punishment is. From a bigger macro perspective, restorative justice is a very valuable tool, and to me, it goes more to how do you restore what's been lost for people due to past racism. But the criminal law it's a very blunt instrument, the criminal justice system. So right now, I think we're at a stage where it's not that easy, particularly with violent crimes, to use the restorative justice principles.
Thank you. From Beth Ann Gentili, would you address measures that might be taken to lessen the tension in urban areas between Asian communities and other minority groups?
I think those are the same lessons that historically we've seen in immigrant communities. There has always been a tension where it was the Irish first coming in versus the Germans versus Jewish. There's always tensions there, even as between Asian immigrants. Whoever is new is oftentimes otherized. And I think one way to address that tension is, again, through awareness and education, to seek to promote the common history, the common understanding of how immigrants, people of color, have suffered, how they've been victimized by violence. The more we make people aware of that shared common history, I think ultimately that goes to lessening that type of tensions. There are more basic things that can happen as well. I mean, many community stores do this where they're trying to reach out to the community around them. And that's a big help. I mean, there was a crime wave quite a few years ago I had done some activism in, which was a lot of mom and pop Korean merchants in DC were being robbed, and there'd been about 8 murders during that time. And one of the things to realize there is that in many of those areas, the only stores that were available for the community were owned by these mom and pops because the big grocery store chains, for example, wouldn't come in. That's all part of a very bigger type of problem, which is looking at what are the economics of these communities, how can you give the communities better resources, and how can you have the communities learn about, oh, we may be resentful that this particular group of people seems to be coming in running these businesses, making them aware of the fact, hey, this group of people is coming here because they have challenges of their own they're trying to overcome. And from a bigger problem, they and this community aren't being serviced well by these large corporations that are choosing through complex algorithms not to put their store in the neighborhoods. So again, I think it's a question of awareness and everyone learning what these problems are and how common the problems really are across the board.
Mm-hmm. On the learning angle, we had some requests. Do you have, Sarah Lippin is wondering in particular, do you have recommendations for certain books on American or Asian American history that would educate people around this topic? Do you have some favorites?
Yeah, I think we might be able to post them later. I want to make sure I get the right titles. There have been quite a few of them. On the Vincent Chin one, there was a very well-known documentary called Who Killed Vincent Chin? Mm-hmm. And my dad worked on a book which is out of print about the history of anti-Chinese legislation. So let us put up maybe a couple of links for folks. I mentioned the Native American thinker Mark Charles, and his book, Unsettling Thoughts, is certainly worth a good read to understand the sort of principles of how this doctrine of discovery has affected kind of institutionalized racism in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Some questions about that are specific to certain situations, and your advice on how they might be handled. I've lost this question somewhere. It was about food. Yes. I get people saying all the time to me that the Chinese eat dog. It always bothers me. How should I respond? Franken Chicken.
Good question. Well, I think one, I don't want to suggest things that could cause you problems or make it into a confrontational situation. So you have to do this with some diplomacy, but you might want to ask them, why are they so concerned about that? What troubles them about that? And you might want to use the Franken Chicken notion. You might want to point out the fact that In some cultures, it would be improper to eat pork, improper to eat beef. So ask them, what are some of the assumptions they're making? What comes to their mind when they say, oh, Chinese eat this weird food, they eat dogs, my gosh. What's going on there for them? What do they think of the Chinese for doing that? And that could start a useful dialogue.
It feels like it's kind of an emotional othering, right? Like, we love dogs. Dogs are cute. They're our friends. They sleep in our beds, but they eat them. Like, how can they not have this feeling? And it's really, all kinds of animals are eaten in different parts of the world, some of which we think are really cute and wouldn't, I guess, right? You don't want to eat cute animals in this culture. Sorry about those sirens. I live in New York and my windows are open.
That's okay. That cuteness is actually another great example of certain implicit assumptions about what is cute. Gee, if we think that kittens are cute or dogs are cute and we would never think of eating them, what about horses? Aren't they cute? You must be from a very alien, otherized culture if you don't share my notion of what is cute and my notion of what is sacred.
A question from Jen. You mentioned that we need to reduce ignorance around, like, our ignorance, society's ignorance around Asians. What do you think could be some effective ways of achieving that goal?
Well, one of the first things that would be effective is having greater diversity in what we see in the media. And I think we're beginning to see a little bit of that. There are more Asians on television, in movies, and many of them have been speaking out about this violence. But I think it's important for people to see a broader diversity of people in our imagery. And that tends to be media. And that's why I place the emphasis on the media there. I also think that American history, as it's taught currently, is very lacking. There's really no well-developed standard curriculum about Asian history. I mean, going back to my dad, like, I think in the 70s was the first time that the City University of New York even had an Asian American Studies course. There's still many places don't have Asian American Studies. It's part of East Asian Studies, studying China, Japan. So that type of education can be better supported and better developed, and ideally more standardized so that it's a regular part of curriculum. And that would be a big help, I think.
Someone brought up the fact that we don't have an AAPI judge on the Supreme Court, and it's not even talked about, right? It doesn't seem to have been a conversation in the mainstream. What do you think about that? And how can is that an important place to start advocating for representation?
I think visually as a symbol, that would be a very important step to have. There are sprinkling more of AAPI judges on federal courts and state courts as well. I think that is an important symbol for that. As to the Supreme Court, don't get me started on that. I have a lot of strong views about that. I think it should be much bigger, for one thing, so then there'd be more room for diversity. But I do think, like media, who you see on a bench in a courtroom makes a big difference. Seeing a person of color who's on the bench makes a big difference to the community. So I think that is a very important place to start.
Okay. There's a reading recommendation in the chat for people looking for those. Feminist legal scholar Mari Matsuda. Well, barring any last minute urgent burning questions, I think we're going to wrap up. And thank you, Shan, for a really, really interesting and engaging conversation and presentation. Now my cat is sitting on my nose. We will share Shan's book recommendations with everyone who registered for this talk. So we'll follow up to those of you who registered with an email with Shan's book recommendations. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight and participating, for the gift of your time and attention dedicated to these important issues. And Sarah Lawrence community, please remember, you do have resources for dealing with and discussing racist events, horrible things that happen, finding support, and also learning together, finding community around people who want to address these issues. And I'll just put we'll send you the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion office email as well to the people who registered. It's very easy. It's diversity_equity_inclusion_ at saralawrence.edu. So if you have questions about what's coming or resources or anything like that, you can always just write to us. I'm one of the people that will pick that up. Okay, I want to thank all our partners and everyone who participated in making this happen. Alumni Relations, Crystal, Allison Wu, Shan Wu, DEI. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thanks, Shan. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.